Welcome to Themis's 20-minute lockdown lowdown. My name is Henry Williams. I'm Head of Investigations at Themis. Themis is a financial crime agency. We help businesses deal with the risks which come with this awful crime. We have a think tank, we have some administrators, and we have an investigations department, as well as a fully loaded membership organisation, which you're all free to join. I'd also like to thank the Arab Bankers Association for giving us the opportunity to speak to their members this morning. In particular, I'd like to thank George Kanan, who very kindly suggested this topic. Now, because this is online, I can't see any of you raising your hands, but if you do have questions, there's the opportunity to type them in here, and then I will endeavour to answer as many of these as possible during this short webinar. Great, well, it's 20 minutes, so we'll kick off now with a poll. Great, so this is actually a chance for you to be interactive here. This is a poll. What do you see as your firm's biggest cyber threat during lockdown? Now, while you're on this, we'll give you a quick minute just to answer this, because obviously we're sort of tight on time. But what I would say is these are the sort of issues we've seen over the last few weeks while we've all been in lockdown. So we'll give you the chance to sort of comment what you think is probably the biggest problem. But the UK's National Cybersecurity Centre says that no security is ever going to be 100% foolproof. All we can do is educate people about the risks. And then the most important thing is to have a good risk management system in place. So if things do go wrong, you can deal with any problems very quickly. Great, so we'll have a look now at what the poll says. Brilliant. Okay, so 50% people say compromised personal computers. That, I would say, is probably the highest risk, and it's certainly what the National Cybersecurity Centre is warning people about constantly. Phishing attacks actually ties into this quite well, because phishing is generally a way for hackers to get on board your personal computer, which can then be used to attack the bank systems or any company systems. And impersonation of customers, we're actually going to be dealing with that a little bit later, because there's one particularly famous example of where this has happened. Right, so now back on to the presentation. Now, never let a good crisis go to waste. I had a look on the internet to try and see if I could find a source for that quote. Google says Winston Churchill, but I'm slightly doubtful about that. What I can say though is that this is the motto of cyber criminals during the coronavirus pandemic and while we're all in lockdown. The reason for this is because, as some of you just identified in that poll, everyone is now working from home on their personal computers. You're away from the security of your bank systems, you're away from the security of the bank's IT department. And particularly when you're on personal computers, you might be flicking on personal websites, on your personal email address. This is all fertile ground for hackers. Equally, what we're also hearing from Arab Bankers Association members we've canvassed is that the simple checks you can do in a bank between front office and back office staff have become much more laborious. Everyone is sitting remotely away from each other, working on different internet speeds, and these can take time. And also, as 8% of you pointed out, impersonation now is a lot easier online than it is in person. And this is a high risk for companies dealing with potential people sending them scam emails. Now, there's also a second issue of the coronavirus pandemic, which is urgency. Now, what this means is that hackers and cyber criminals can use the sort of sense of crisis which has enveloped us all to try and persuade you to click on malicious there. Well, have we got a first question in? Sorry, 2 seconds. No questions yet. Do keep them coming, though. Now, the issue here is that urgency can remove your doubt and restrictions excuse unusual behaviour. And what I'm thinking of in particular would be such as, like in a trade finance, if a letter of credit was being held up because vital PPE wasn't getting through to people, or if someone was saying, well, I need to pay for an urgent medical bill, you don't want to be the person talking to a trusted customer saying, I need to get back to you in 2 hours while I make these checks. So we'll go now in a bit more detail about how hackers are working at the moment. Let's get this done. Okay, so phishing is something you're going to be hearing quite a lot about. So GCHQ, the UK government's listening agency, say they've taken down 2,000 coronavirus scams over the last 6-7 weeks. I've also seen one statistic where someone has mentioned they've seen 2,000 new websites appearing a day. Each of these are infected with a certain type of malware to do with coronavirus. So they might say, here's a place you can buy hand sanitizer, and you click on the website and it causes malware to be downloaded on a computer. Sorry, I'm trying to keep this as jargon-free as possible. So when I say malware, what I mean essentially is computer viruses. These can be anything from something which would turn your computer into a bot where it can join up with 10,000 other infected computers and be used to do large-scale internet hacking. Equally, it could be something called a remote access Trojan. It's slightly misnomered because what they mean is an ancient Greek, as in they sneak onto your system undetected from where they cause havoc. Remote access Trojans are particularly scary because they can take over your video camera on your computer or record your keystrokes. Each of these is a very good way of finding out secret information you don't want to be sharing with people. So how do these Trojans get onto your system? This brings us back to phishing. Now, phishing is so cool as it's a virus which uses bait. Now, cyber criminals will dangle the virus, the malware, in a form which might encourage you to click on it. Once you clicked on it, maybe on an email or from a compromised website, they can wreak havoc. So the trick of cyber criminals is to make them attractive or to give you a sense that you have to be clicking on this, so maybe by arousing your curiosity. So what I'd say is what they use is something we all know as high pressure sales techniques. So I'm just checking, we've got a couple more questions coming through. I'm just going to hold off for a second while we just go through what phishing is. Okay, so phishing, the tactics they would use is something like scarcity, urgency, emotion, or authority. Now, these are the sort of ways, so these are the ways they would get you to click on a link. Well, we all know we're not supposed to click on links, but these are ways to manipulate you into doing so. So, for instance, what you might see is, here's a link to getting hold of some scarce medicines from a hacker's shop. Or the one which a lot of people find is the appeal to authority. I know we're not going quite there yet. So the appeal to authority is very interesting because they might say, I'm an important government minister and here's our latest information. And one thing we've noticed is the World Health Organization has been a particular target during the pandemic. They say they're receiving 5 times as many cyber attacks they would normally at this time of year. And that's because hackers are trying to get vital data and also harvest their emails, from which they can then launch phishing attacks on people who are curious about the coronavirus. So this is how hackers operate. They're very good emotional manipulators. They're more like confidence tricksters, and you have to be very aware of how they operate. This brings me on to whaling, which is something from a corporate point of view. It's very interesting, but it's also quite scary. So phishing is sort of a hacker sitting on a lake with sort of dangling something and hoping someone will bite. Whaling's much more getting tooled up and going out hunting for your corporate Moby Dick, so to speak. So what they'll do here is they'll use open source information to find out as much information as they can about their target. Typically, these will be senior management or high net worth individuals. So they might go on their daughter's social media account, they might look at what charities a firm is associated with, or they might see what they've been reported about in the business press. And then they'll use all of these to tailor an attack and make it plausible so that you'll click on a link. Now, one particularly sneaky example I came across when I was doing research for this webinar was the case of an accountant from a Big 4 firm. They were doing a test exercise, and so a hacker looked him up, found his address on the UK electoral roll, and from there he used Google Street View to discover that one of his neighbours had extensive building works going on. So the hacker very craftily then sent the executive an email saying, hello, I'm your neighbour, I'm very sorry for all this disruption I'm causing, but if you're interested in what we're doing, here's a link to it. And sure enough, the link contained malware which attacked the executive. What I find very interesting here is the good news was it was only a training exercise. The bad news was that the person knew they were being targeted and still clicked on a malicious link. Equally, I'd also just quite quickly like to mention an example we had from our bankers when we were doing research for this webinar. What the hackers did in this case was they pretended to be the private office of a high net worth individual. Now, this is a great ruse because it excuses not being the individual themselves, not using their personal email address, but using plausible knowledge they'd gleaned online to try and hack their way into this person's individual private bank account. Right, so moving swiftly on. So what we have here is the painting by John Constable, A View of Hampstead Heath. Now, this is another issue people ought to be aware of, which is the dangers of false invoicing. So in this case, Dickinson, which is a small art dealer in London, owned a painting by John Constable. It was sold to the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam for £2.4 million. In the midst of the sale, some hackers based in Hong Kong put their invoice in, so the Rijksmuseum paid them rather than Dickinson's in London. And as a result, the hackers absconded with £2.4 million, which was a good day's work for them. Sadly, the Dickinsons of Rijksmuseum are stuck in a court case over who is actually liable for this now. So it's a real issue. Okay, great. We have a question coming through, which I'll just answer quickly, just while we sort of keep this all going. So are Apple devices more difficult for hackers to invade with malware, etc.? What I'd say is that you're sort of dealing with different systems. So you're dealing with iOS and Windows, and hackers will typically tailor both their approaches to be able to get their way through. So the answer very simply is it varies. No one system is more secure than the others. I tend to find Windows are very good at patching their software. Patching is when they might have found a weakness in their software, which hackers have already worked out how to exploit. I use Windows a lot, and they're very good at reminding me to do so. I find Apple slightly more cumbersome, but what I would say is that both are widely used by people, and if they're widely used, they're also widely targeted by hackers. So yeah, sorry, there's no one particular way. It's more the protocols are your best against them. Now, one area also I understand that Arab banks are heavily involved in is trade finance. Now, I'd just like to talk about this quickly because this is a slightly different issue, but I think it's quite important. Trade finance, you're normally dealing with letters of credit, you're dealing with paper-based concerns. This has all gone digital now, and the checks have become much more laborious between the people doing the actual deal and the back office staff. So it's an issue to be aware of. But one thing someone particularly mentioned to us was how they often need to track vessels, which are sort of carrying shipments they're financing. And also you need to check, for instance, these vessels aren't turning off their transponders if you're going through the Crimea, for instance. Normally these will be firewalled by a bank's IT department. Obviously that's not the case when you're working from home, so you need to take extra care. Yeah, we have someone's just popped in, sorry, before we go on to that poll, someone's also mentioned that they have a Mac using Apple software and they were still attacked by a virus. So please don't get a full sense of security. You need to use antivirus software and you need to sort of have good security protocols. So that's the sort of scary side of it. What I'd like to talk about now quickly is what we can do to mitigate it. But before we do that, I'd just like to have a quick poll of what you think has been the most effective mitigation strategies you've seen during lockdown against cyber criminals. Okay, so I think that poll has started now. While you're on that, what I would just also address, which is another issue, is video conferencing. We're kind of on a video conference now. I imagine most of you are all using this. Obviously, you have to be careful. You're not sure who else might be on a video conference out of sight, particularly if discussing sensitive customer data. And I'd just like to draw one example, which was the Evening Standard and the Independent were having very confidential chats with all their staff about redundancies during coronavirus. And a Financial Times journalist who used to work there still had his old email account, so was sent the address to the conference and duly listened in and got the scoop of what was going on. And then equally, he got caught and got fired. So you do have to be really careful about this, particularly if you're sending out company-wide emails. Okay, great. So now let's have a look at how this poll has gone. Okay, so the majority of you are saying working from home protocols, that's 48%, are the best mitigation strategy against cybercrime. And certainly I would suggest that is really good. Also, I think cyber training and testing is really important. But perhaps one of the most important things, which 19% of you have picked up on, is a virtual private network. Now, these are particularly useful for dealing with compromised systems. So what they are designed for is to deal with, say you were working from home on a compromised laptop, the virtual private network sets up an automatic firewall which will screen out any viruses before you log onto your company's system. Equally, they can be designed by an IT department so that they'll limit access to high-risk websites, or if you have any documents which you need to go through, the VPN gives your IT department a chance to check them. Now, there's a number of these on the open market, and we can certainly advise people about what are the best strategies. and best ones to use. But certainly, if you're not using a virtual private network at the moment, you should be by now. And these are certainly, while we're in lockdown and you have a lot of staff working from home, these are one of the most important strategies. I'm just going to quickly, we just got another question. So how are we doing on time? Yes, okay. You mentioned that you had some interviews with senior bankers in preparation for this. Are there any really good examples of things you can find companies to do? Well, I'm glad you mentioned that. So we did have a couple of interviews with some chief risk officers from our banks, and there's some very clever ideas and very simple ideas you can institute. And certainly one of these actually which came up was VPNs. I'm actually going to come on to that a little bit later in the presentation. So if you can hold fire for a couple of minutes, I'll bring that on to you. But just finally, the other thing on VPNs is that they rely on two-factor authentication. Now, that's really useful. That will be when a code gets sent to your mobile phone and you can log in with your email address and password, but you need to have this code as well. So that means that hackers have to have compromised your phone as well as your computer, which is much less likely and therefore adds another layer of security. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a VPN, but any passwords systems you're using should have two-factor authentication. And there's some really simple apps in the marketplace you can just download onto your phone, which will enable you to do this. So that's a huge recommendation I'd have. Now onto the cyber training and testing. So what we know here is that employees are the first line of defense essentially when it comes to cybercrime for businesses. I always feel that's a bit harsh because it's not really like you signed up to be on the front line of anything when you're sort of working in a nice office, but sadly it is the reality of what we're dealing with. So cyber awareness training should encompass phishing, as we discussed, and also the social engineering aspect of phishing, because it's not just senior executives who will be targeted in this. It can be anyone around the company. Certainly, we had a webinar on cybercrime, and Professor Richard Benham, who's one of the UK government's top advisors on cybercrime, mentioned that hackers are generally working morning, noon, and night, and 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, looking to attack administrative staff as a easy backdoor into sort of vital systems. So it's something you should definitely be aware of, is social engineering. Equally, you have the dangers of USB sticks lying around. So that's something which, malware can be incorporated onto a computer. It doesn't have to be over the internet. It can be on a USB stick. People should be very careful about that. You should use different passwords between your personal accounts and your business accounts, so that if one gets compromised, the other one doesn't. As you said, two-factor authentication. And then the final thing, which I think I mentioned slightly when we were dealing with whether Apple or Microsoft's the safest system, is that periodically these firms will discover backdoors into their software, which have already been found by hackers. And it's really important. They will update these. And so it's really important, if you get the nod from your computer to update your security system, you really should, because that will protect you as best they can from hackers. Now, finally, I'd also like to add, there's a lot of information out there, and a lot of people feel they get a bit bombarded with information about cybersecurity. So it's really important, if there's an audience you're looking to send this to, that you don't let them get jaded. Certainly what I found has been one of the best ways of stopping people getting jaded is by finding a sort of a nice juicy example, which, I mean, there are every week. You can send an email saying this is what's happened in cybercrime. And so if you look at the VPNs we were just talking about, for instance, a VPN was actually hacked, and I kind of feel this is the exception, which proves the rule about how good they are, was that they had to use something called a zero-day exploit. Now, a zero-day is a type of hack which is so rare it tends to get stockpiled by government, or it sells for millions on the open market. So the fact that these cyber criminals, I think they're called Dark Hotel, and they're based in North or South Korea, the fact that they had to use a zero-day hack to compromise a VPN shows just how good they are. But equally, these are the kind of things which get patched as soon as they can. So back onto this. Oh yes, this is very important. So when you do have a cyber breach, it's very important to communicate to employees that the reporting framework is non-judgmental. You have to remember, when people have been phished, it's because they've been manipulated, not because they're being malicious themselves. And the least said, soonest mended is certainly a maxim in IT. You need people to be able to firewall less important data. So before a cyber criminal has had a chance to go rooting around your vital systems, it's very important that you know it's happened. So any company reporting structure needs to be sympathetic rather than judgmental. So finally, I'd just like to come on to some stuff we heard from the Arab Bankers Association members we surveyed. So what I find really interesting, certainly in the Arab banking concept, is the importance of personal relationships. Now, this is one of the best mitigating strategies against cybercrime. If you know who you're dealing with, you know how they speak, you know how they operate, you've got their phone number so you can phone them back, then that's a really good way of countering any sort of cybercriminal activity. Also, what I would say is here, it's really important to manage customer expectations. They should know that you are going to have to take longer doing ordinary checks because of the heightened risk, and it should be communicated to your customers that this is the case. I'd also say some of the strategies we've heard which have really worked very well is planning. So we spoke to one chief risk officer who mentioned that his IT staff send a test phishing email around the company every month, seeing how many people will click on it. And that's a really good way of sort of mimicking the tactics of cyber criminals, so that you can so that your employees can be aware of what happens. Equally, instituting working from home protocols, I think we said in the poll that was the best thing you could do, and certainly it's true. I would say of those working from home protocols, it's really important is the training aspect, and you should definitely be using a VPN. And as I say, if you're not using one now, it's very easy to get them instituted. Right. So finally, I would just like to say there's lots of good virus software. There's lots of good virus software out there, and people have asked in particular what to deal with on Macintoshes and iPhones. I'd say Kaspersky Lab is one which we often get recommended. There's also McAfee, and there's plenty of other traditional ones. Some of these are often tailored to specific systems, so it's worth doing your research, and this is certainly something Themis can help with. So finally, just to finish up, as I know we're coming to the end of our 20 minutes, what I'd like to say is that if this webinar has raised any concerns for you, please feel free to contact us at Themis. Also, if you're a Themis member, we're going to be continuing this conversation on the Themis Senate, where I will be online and I'll be trying to answer as many questions as possible. And yeah, we should be able to offer something really good. I've also just been informed actually one of our members offers great cybersecurity, so you should also take a look at Glasswall, who are leaders in this space and also very kindly shared a lot of their expertise with Themis. So anyway, thanks again for joining us this morning. I hope it's been useful, and I hope it hasn't taken up too much of your time. Great.